Hello, 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 Internet, and good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. Welcome to Code It Live. I'm your host, Sam Basu. With me, I have my good friend, Barret Blake. How are you, sir?
Doing great. Thank you.
Good, good. All right, so this is a user group meeting. Since the pandemic, we have kind of switched to, all online, same content, but we just get to hang out online and have speakers on who want to share their passion, and Barrett's here. Thank you for being here. This is for the global app dev user group. We are completely digital. Hello, Integer Man, good to see you. I actually have you on slide because we had Integer Man is our good friend Matt Eland, and he was the speaker last month. And I think you're speaking again at another user group this month, or maybe the last month's thing didn't happen, or maybe just Matt just speaks about ML wherever he can, whenever he can. So good to see you here, Matt. Let's roll. I'm going to start with a couple of housekeeping things, and then I'll hand it over to Barret. So let's see if I can share my screen. Oh, this is going to be fun because Chrome installed an update, and let's see if it remembers to share. Yeah, it's asking me to for permissions because I installed Catalina, the Mac OS update, and then Chrome installs. It's lost the permission to share my screen, which is this is fun. Well, Barret, would you mind if I feared the demo gods? Yeah. Well, I didn't think I would have demos, but clearly I fail a lot, and that's okay. Would you mind if I leave you alone on stream for
Not a problem.
30 seconds, just so I can kill Chrome and I can share the permissions to get back? Let me open up that screen just so I take no time at all to bring this up. So what has happened is in my security policies, let me check screen recording. Let me open this up. It has Google Chrome on. I just need to, I think check it and uncheck it to come back. Okay. So, Barret, if you know like stand-up comedy, this might be your this might be a moment of,
I know a lot of dad jokes.
Yeah, go for a dad joke. So, folks, I'll be back in 30 seconds or less. I just need to, kill Chrome and bring it back. Okay, I'll be right back.
Isn't technology great? Now, of course, he's off doing that, and I can't see the chat, so I don't have any idea what anybody's saying. So hopefully, you have a lot of witty comments. There we go.
I am back. Now, let's see if it lets me share my screen now. There we go. All because of updates. Yeah, so this is the screen recording thing that you have to enable. And sometime it had Google Chrome, but for some reason it forgot. So I had to uncheck it and bring it back. So yes, to your point, technology is beautiful. Okay, we are ready. So let's officially start. Welcome everybody. We did this last month. If you're looking for like the evolution story, we kind of started with Windows Phone days. We became Windows, and then it was just app dev, and now we are just global because we are entirely virtual. So please tell your friends and other developers or architects or anybody working in the software industry about us. We are online on our website, meetup group, Twitter, and we meet right here on Twitch every third Monday of each month. All right, we do have a couple of sponsors who kind of help us, put this thing together. Support from Microsoft, support from Progress Software, and we do partner up with Visual Studio Live, which I'll talk about. We always mention a couple of, sister user groups or things happening nearby. So Matt is on again. This is for the .NET user group, or maybe last month it didn't happen. So this is the fourth Thursday of each month, and this is in person. So go see Matt talk about ML.NET. And I didn't realize this until I looked. Yeah, okay, last month got punted due to weather. I see. Oh, and Ukraine, yes. And we always say this at the start. The world, we wish it was in a happier place with our global pandemic that's still not gone everywhere. And any type of military conflict is very undesirable. So there are a lot of people hurting. We have tried raising our funds and doing the best we can as individuals, but we do hope you and your friends and family are safe and you're taken care of. So if you want to learn about ML, and if you're around the Central Ohio area, go see Matt coming up next Thursday. Okay, a couple of regional conferences. This is Codestock, one of my favorite ones to go to. This is coming up early April. This is in Knoxville, Tennessee. 3 days of solid content. One is a workshop day. No, I think there are 7th and 8th, so 2 days of content. So again, great speakers. It's not a bad drive if you are in the Midwest. So if your time permits, if you have the budget, or if your employer wants to help you go learn some new tech, that's a great place to be. And if you are in Columbus, Ohio, this is coming up in early May. Kind of coincides with the Marvel release this summer. It's Doctor Strange and the Multiverse. So that's coming up, and Star Trek has always been a tech conference and a movie altogether. That's coming up May 6th at the AMC theaters. Yeah, woo Star Trek. So it should be fun, and hopefully we'll see a lot of you in person in Columbus, Ohio. Speaking of conferences, this is a bigger set of conferences. Like the Microsoft or Google ones. This is brought together kind of professionally. So they do it in several big cities around the country. And the pandemic had a few hiccups for them, but they're back. So the next one is in Austin. This is like a full 5-day tech conference, and if you go through the user group, you get a big discount. So just take a look if any of those ones are of interest to you. This is in Austin. Then they have Microsoft Redmond campus. Then they have San Diego, and then Orlando throughout the rest of the year. And tonight we have Mr. Barret Blake, sparing us a little bit of his precious time to talk about data. And moving mountains of data. We had Matt on last month, and he talked about doing all the stuff with data so you make sense of it. And today you're going to talk about moving the data, right? And I know nothing about ETL. I know nothing about data factories, so I'm just here to learn. So with that, Barret, I'm going to stop and hand it over to you.
All right.
So let's stop that. And let me move my window so I can see you straight up. And if you're ready, I'm going to bring your other monitor up. Okay, There you go. Massive mountains of magnificent data. All right, sir. Floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right. So we're going to be talking about, is moving data around using what they call ETL systems. And I'll talk a little bit introduction-wise as to what those are. And as an example, there are tons of systems like that out there, and we're going to use Azure Data Factory as our example this evening. So just by way of introduction about myself, it's just a little bit about me. I do a lot of things and get around there. So if you want to know anything else about me, feel free to reach out. So we have data. We have all kinds of data, huge amounts of it all over the place. We have database systems, we have flat files, we have data warehouses, we have external systems, internal systems. We've got all this data, and we need, in order to make our businesses successful, we need to be able to merge that data together, get it to work together, get it linked together in all kinds of different ways so that we can have a productive use of that data. And one of the ways to get that data together and to merge it together are what's called ETLs. And ETL stands for extract, transform, and load. So generally with ETLs, you have data in one place, you want to take it out of there. You may or may not want to make some changes to that data, transform it, and then you load it into a destination system. Maybe it's another system, a data warehouse, might be something else like that. And then very closely related to that, they have what's called ELT, which basically just reverses the last two steps. You have extract, load, and then transform. So either way, it works. So this just kind of does a little contrast and comparison between the two types of systems. The biggest difference between the two is that with ETLs, you generally have a middleware system, some kind of application that sits in between your two sets of data, and that handles any of the transformations that are needed. It can be a little bit more maintenance intensive because you have to set that up. You have to set up all the transformations. You have to make those connections between the various systems. And then as opposed to that on the ELT side, you just move the data and then you transform that data once it's in the destination. So there are plus and minuses to both. It's just a matter of how you want to handle it. As far as platforms, there are a prolific amount of applications out there that you can use for ETL. And just popping up on the screen here is just a small sample. This doesn't even cover a quarter of the systems that are out there. There are just tons of them. And most of them have fairly similar functionality-wise. They all basically can connect to external systems. They can move that data around, transform it in various ways, or maintain things. But yeah, there's just a ton of options out there, and they do have a lot of variation in how they work. Some of them are server-based, some of them are on-prem, some of them are like Windows applications, some of them are web-based, cloud hosted, whatever it may be. So the one we're going to kind of talk about and focus on tonight is Azure Data Factory, and that is an entirely cloud-based system. So some of the common use cases for ETLs. So one of the most common ones in use today is a product recommendation system. So you have your sales data, you have your customer data, you have your sales history data, your product tracking, and you want to get all that together into a system that can generate recommendations to customers that might be beneficial, and then send that information back to your e-commerce or whatever it might be, your marketing ads, however you want to target getting to the customer. Most commonly you'll see that like when you go on Amazon, when you're looking at a product page, you'll see things like, people who have purchased this have also purchased this, and this, that kind of stuff. Or if you like this, you might like, these 5 items, whatever it might be. Another one of them, and closely related to that, is a customer targeted marketing system. So obviously your marketing dollars are best spent when you can focus in and get the best kind of recommendations for a customer. So ETLs can help you build that kind of thing. The next most common one is data warehouse construction. So obviously you have all these disparate systems. You want to get all that data into one system for your reporting purposes. And then just moving data around a lot. So, whether it's between your ERP and your warehouse management system, whether it's between your HR system and your ERP, whether it's between your customer relational management system and your ERP system, there's just all kinds of ways that you need to move data back and forth and connect these various systems. Another common one is log analysis. You look at something like bug tracking or things like that, being able to collect all this various log information from different systems and being able to put it into a central place so that you can report on it, so that you can track bugs and errors and issues and track customer movement, that kind of stuff. And then, of course, just the most common thing, just doing data migrations from place to place, whether you're migrating from a legacy system to a new system, whether you're you just need to move data back and forth between whatever it might be, any two different systems. And then, of course, converting the type of data. Maybe you need to convert from one format to another format. Maybe you need to go from a comma delimited system to a SQL server to a flat file, whatever it might be.
Hey, Barret.
Yes.
I got a quick question, and I did warn Barret that I will, ask dumb questions.
Yeah, not a problem. Anytime.
Okay, so I get the L and the T, but conceptually, can you talk more about the extraction? Like, what is it that you're having to extract out, and in what format? You also talked about like Hipaa and other compliancy. Like, is that the data like cleanup act?
So let me go back here. You're talking about things like Hipaa and GDPR and that kind of thing?
Yeah, yeah. So like I understand like the three pillars, like whether you
Mhm.
do load or transform first, but like the extraction part, like is that like your raw data? Is that what you're talking about, or
Yeah,
is there
basically just grabbing the data in whatever format it is, wherever it's at. So, maybe it's in a CSV file, maybe it's in a SQL Server database, maybe it's in an Oracle database, maybe it's in another data warehouse, and you want to merge that with the second data warehouse or something like that. So
I
it can
see.
be any kind of data in any format in any digital location, really.
Okay.
And
So
you
here,
just
when you talk about like the transform part, like the compliancy,
Mhm.
this is the transform part that's doing the clearing up of the data, so it's nothing sensitive.
Yeah. So you're doing things like that to hide sensitive data or to encrypt it or whatever it might be. Maybe you just need certain subset of the data, but you can't extract just the subset from the original source. So you pull that in. Maybe you need to, for instance, if you're moving from like a SQL Server database to like an old COBOL-based system where it's fixed with flat files, that kind of thing. That's the kind of transformations that you can make. So really just
Okay.
converting it from any format to almost any other format.
Sure. Okay.
Let's get back up to these. So just by way of examples for Azure Data Factory. So Azure Data Factory, as I mentioned, is entirely cloud-based. You can actually code it in C#, but the most common interface is web-based. It's a lot like if you have experience working with SSIS packages. It's a lot of drag and drop and configuration, that kind of stuff, connecting one step to another step to another step. And here's kind of an example here on the screen of some like a typical pipeline that you might create. And I'll talk about some of the terminology as we go through here. So the entire data movement and transformation in Data Factory is called a pipeline. So it's from your first step to your last step and everything in between. All that together is your pipeline. Within that pipeline, you have activities, which are each of the individual steps. And there are different kinds of activities, and I'll talk through some of those as we get through here. You also have what's called link services, and those are your connections to your external system. So one link service might connect to a SQL server, another might connect to Azure Blob, where you might have flat files at. Another one might connect to an FTP server, any external connection outside of the system. And then you have your data sets, which represent the data connections or the data that's on those connections. So a data set might be a file, a data set might be a database table, a data set might be a file on an FTP site somewhere like that. And then you have data flows, which are kind of the most complex data transformation. So if you need to do something really complex, that's a place that you would do that is in the data flows. And then you have the integration runtimes, which are your basically your executables that run various places. So while Data Factory itself is cloud-based, you can have, or you sometimes need to have those integration runtimes, which are the executables running on an on-prem server. So if you're connecting from Data Factory to, for instance, an on-premises SQL server, you would have to install an integration runtime somewhere on your network to give you that access to your network and the systems that are on that network.
Yeah, makes sense. In the chat room, Matt is talking about how like the pipelines are familiar to Azure Synapse Analytics, which I have no idea what it does. Azure is just so many things nowadays.
It is, yeah. There are a ton of different things. So, yeah, I don't have any experience with Synapse myself either, but excuse me. But a lot of the interfaces that they're doing with a lot of the Azure products nowadays are also very similar. So if you've worked with like Logic Apps or Data Factory, there's also very similar to that. A lot of the configuration for an Azure function, a lot of that can also look fairly similar. So let's go ahead and jump into some demos here. Bring up the screen.
So before or while you get this up, like from what you are describing, and again, I don't know anything about this, but it sounds like it's a whole a lot of configurations to declare your pipeline, and essentially you're moving data from one spot to another. And this is not like, you haven't set up your transformations yet, have you, or is that part of the pipeline?
Those will be part of the pipeline, those transformations, and I'll walk through some of those. And like I mentioned, the most common one is what's called a data flow. And I'll walk through an example of that as well as we get through here. But there's all kinds of different things you can do for the transformations within the system. So.
Good to know. And Matt's pointing out, since I don't know anything about, you don't know anything about signups, we got our good friend Carrie Pyatt talking about pipelines in May in Star Trek.
Yeah, might be good. I'll be volunteering at Star Trek, so I won't get to see a lot of the stuff that I want to, but we'll see what I get access to. So. All right. So when you first connect in through your Azure portal, which is how you get into Azure Data Factory, when you open up a Data Factory, you'll get this screen here where, anybody who's familiar with Azure, this will look very familiar to you. This is the main configuration screen for that. The biggest thing here is this button right here. So this opens the interface where you will be doing your actual Azure Data Factory configuration and programming. So when you click on that, you will come to this screen here. Let me, oops. Just close that for a minute, just so I don't get too much clutter here. So this is the initial screen that you'll get to when you're doing your Data Factory work. So you have your 4 main menu items over here. Home just takes you, of course, back here to the main button. You have your author menu, which is where you'll do your actual design and programming configuration. You have your monitor screen here. And this is where you can access the history of runs. Depending on your configuration, it generally goes back about 6 weeks. So you can look at any previous runs over the last 6 weeks. I don't know that I have anything actually in here recently. Okay, no. This is just my demo system, but I can show you some examples of that here in a minute. And then you have your management screen here. So this is where you can create things like your link services, which is your external connections. You can also create those inline as you're working on the pipeline. You can configure your integration runtime. So when you have a data factory set up, you have your core integration runtime, which is where it runs from in the cloud. And then if you've installed any on-prem integration runtimes on other systems, you'll see those here and can configure them here as well. One of the nice things about Data Factory is that it links into Git. So if you have a Git repository to track your code, you can use that to in fact, for most of the parts, you really have to have it configured and set up. So any of your code changes, anything that you need to do like that, you can create branches. You can work on stuff individually separate from other people. And then, when you're done, you merge it back together and do your publishing. And it also can implement things like CI/CD pipelines to move it from one environment to another. If you have any ARM templates based on that, you can set those up here as well. So when you run a pipeline from Data Factory itself, you have a trigger, which it can be, either an event trigger. So since if it's somebody drops a file in a file share, or it can run on a schedule. Those are the 2 most common triggers. You can configure those here. And again, you can also configure them within the pipeline itself. If you have any global parameters that you want to set up, you can set those up here, and then they'll be accessible to all of the pipelines that you have running. And then any security setup that you can do is here as well. So let me go back over here to the author screen. So one of the nice things is it lets you set up templates. I don't have it here in this test environment, but if you want to create several similar pipelines, you can create a template and then easily and quickly create various versions of that. But up here in the very top, you have your pipeline section. So these are where you'll set up your pipelines. I'll walk through those in a little more detail here, and then data sets and data flows, and we'll talk about each of those.
So Barret, in terms of the data sets that you showed, I'm guessing it will connect to just really any type of data, like relational, non-relational. It doesn't care, on-prem, in the cloud.
Pretty much, yeah. And let me just do a new one here, so you can see these are all the different types of connections that you can get to from Data Factory. So you can go to RDS, you can go to Amazon, you can go to Blob Storage in Azure, Cosmos DB, data lakes, SQL servers, just on and on. There's all kinds of different data sources here. And they're constantly adding new ones as well. So like FTP sites, Dynamics, Google AdWords. I think every time I come in here, there's a new data set or a new link service that gets added so that you can connect to.
Yeah.
So Salesforce, SAP,
Salesforce,
that kind of stuff.
I saw like Postgres, I saw Couchbase, I saw MongoDB, Cassandra. It's a lot. Yeah.
And if you have like a web API, you can connect it pretty much any web API as well. So yeah, there are a lot of options for where you can get to your data and where you can send data to. There's that. So, and oops, sorry. And if you select one of those, within each one, you'll obviously have the different types of data that you can get to. So for instance, here in Azure Blob Storage, you can connect to binary files, flat files, Excel spreadsheets, XML files, JSON, so on and so forth. And each one will have a different subset, depending on what it is that you're connecting to. So for instance, you're going to Redshift. Basically, I guess there's only one option there for Redshift, but configuration of the link service is pretty straightforward too. You just basically have to have the connection info, and if there is any security involved, like a sign in or a key or anything like that, a certificate, that you would all do that configuration when you're setting up your configuration there. So for instance, this one here. So for here, I'm using an account key connecting to a blob storage account. You put the key in, that kind of stuff. So you can also set up default parameters or required parameters as well. If you have any parameters for that connection, for instance, if you want to have the pipeline pass in the password or something like that, you could do that as well, that kind of thing. Okay. So that's kind of the link service and that. Data sets themselves, basically those are built on top of the link service. So each data set has a link service that it connects to. In this particular case, it's a CSV flat file. So in this case, I'm using the Azure Blob Storage, and then I put in like the file path. And these can be passed in as parameters as well, so that you can have your pipeline tell the link service or tell the data set which file to get, that kind of thing. And that makes it easy for you to have, for instance, a single data set that can be representative of a bunch of different things. So maybe you just have a connection to a SQL server that has 20 tables in it. You only need one data set really for that, unless you're doing stuff that's schema specific. That way you just pass in a parameter, for instance, for the name of the name of the database table, and get back all the data from that. So
can you in a single data set have multiple sources?
No. So you can't have in a single not in a single data set. For those kind of instances, you would use a data flow. And actually, let me go over here to this one. So this is the kind of the format of how data flow works. So in this particular case, you can have multiple sources and then combine all that data together into a derived set of data. So yeah, you can do it, but not in the link services themselves. You have to do it within a data flow.
Gotcha.
So yeah, if I wanted to have this from a SQL server and a flat file and Salesforce and something else, I could do all that here and then create that connection. And really, that's fairly easy to do. Whoops. If I were to add a source here, I just tell it what it is. I'm pulling stuff from my workers table. Then once I've got my source set up, then I can create a join. And then within my join, I can tell it, what's on the left, what's on the right. So there, I want to join these two together, and then I'll tell it how to join. So
look at that. This is like a very visual way of combining multiple data sources.
So maybe if I want to combine the rec ID on the one side with the rec ID on the other, and an inner join between the two. So a lot of the join stuff is very SQL Server related. So if you're familiar working with SQL Server, doing the joins in here is treated a lot the same way, even if the data is coming from another kind of source. For instance, this one's from SQL. Actually, these are both SQL, but if I want to take it from a flat file as well, once it's in here and you define the schemas for it, it basically treats them all like they're database tables, which in essence they are in the back end. So, let's see here. So, and as you can see here, once you've merged stuff together, you have a combined output that you can then use to create your final destination. So even in here, you can also have multiple output files. So you can come up with ways to split that data. So say, for instance, you have a parent company and they have like 10 sub companies below them, and you're trying to draw a bunch of different data, and you want to combine all that data from various companies and then do some processing on it. And then you want to output one file per company for reporting purposes or whatever it might be. You can easily do that here within your data flow. So you just, when you get down to this final step, you come up with a way to break that data back apart. So for instance, based on the company ID, and then you can have it define multiple output files, one for each of those companies. So, so not only can you have multiple inputs in a data flow, you can have multiple outputs as well.
And when you're combining things like this in a data flow, like you showed us with the data sets, you have things like triggers. Is there any concept like this here?
Not within the data flow itself. Really, the triggers are only at the parent level, at the pipeline level. You can come up with kind of pseudo versions of that. If you want to do conditional things in one way or the other, that gets a little more complicated though.
Okay.
But it is doable.
Yeah. All right. Now, so far, you're blowing our minds here by showing us what's possible. But in the chat room, and by the way, chat room, feel free to ask any questions of Barret, and we'll stop. So Matt is asking the question that I was going to raise. Show me the money. So, what's the freemium? What does this all cost?
So like a lot of things in Azure, it's based on usage. So I'm not sure. Oops, where'd my screen go? There we go.
So to Matt's point, if you have, let's say, a pipeline that's pulling from a single data set and you're acting on it, let's say you have those triggers, and is it dependent on when they fire and it takes processing power to act on it? Or just the fact that you have that pipeline built is going to cost you something?
No, yeah. If the pipeline's not running, you're not being charged.
Okay.
So yeah, there's that. So yeah, getting into the pricing thing is probably more complex than I'm able to do. But here's a fairly simple version of it. So essentially 0.005 cents per hour. Excuse me. And that's for the built-in runtime. They also charge you if you're running, hosting runtimes on your on-prem services, so things like that. Generally, when it gets to the point where somebody's using this, because this is basically an enterprise level, application, they generally don't concern themselves too much with the cost at that point. But you do get some customers who will nitpick on those kinds of details and will want to know. And you can kind of come up with a rough pricing estimate, but until you actually start getting there, building some of those pipelines and figuring out how often they need to run and how much data they're going to process, you really can't get a good estimate of what the actual end cost is going to be, to be honest with you. So many of these, run-based pricing.
Yeah. So. No, that makes sense. Azure pricing can get tricky. And, this is very enterprisey, if I may say, because I can have some personal needs for this, but it'll be like a trickle of what the overall enterprise workflow story might be. This is for big data and
this is definitely for so definitely for big data and enterprise architecture. If you're looking to do something personal or something like that, I would recommend using Power Automate instead. It's far cheaper and it doesn't have obviously all the features and connections. and capabilities, but you can come up with you can approximate most of the functionality and do it in a less performant but a lot cheaper way. So
yeah. No, I am amazed. This is kind of all like when you talk about Power Automate, it's like the similar family of things. Like I have built like Teams applications, like simple connections between multiple things, and the power of just doing things visually, configuring it, and just like pulling data from multiple sources. It's quite amazing what we can get done.
Yeah, it really is. It's very cool, the kinds of stuff that you can get away with and achieve. So let me dig into some of the functionality within the activities. So obviously, the simplest pipeline only has like a single activity. This one's a very simple copy activity. For each of your copy activity, you would have a source, which is where you're getting the data from. You would have a sink, which is the destination. If depending on the destination, you can do a pre-copy script. So, for instance, if you want to copy a database table from one server to another, and then you just want to truncate the table beforehand, you just come in here and write your truncate statement. It would run that before it copies the data over. If the data has different column names in the two, or different field names, you can map the data manually if you want to, or you can let it automatically map, however you want to do it. So this is the most simple and most common activity, is the simple copy data step. And then, as I mentioned, with the data flows, that gets into much more complex. If you need to do the transformation, a lot of complex stuff, doing the joining, doing the break apart and the output, that kind of stuff, you would do as a data flow for that. Some of the other stuff, you can get into Azure Data Explorer. You can call Azure Functions, and you can either have it. It can either be a fire and forget, or it can be a wait for response kind of thing. So if you have an Azure function that's doing something, you can call it from here. You can run custom batch jobs. If you're into Databricks, you can go out and interact with those. Data Lake, if you want to do some analytics to your data lake. You have the ability to have parameters and variables. So parameters are things that be passed in to the pipeline, but you can default some values. If you want to have variables that you work with within the pipeline, so if you need to store data and maybe use it later in a different step, you can set that up as a variable. You can also have, there's a couple of different settings here. One of the biggest ones is concurrency. So it's whether it will run multiple iterations of the pipeline at the same time, in parallel, or whether you want to force it to queue up. For instance, I had one client who they had a vendor come in and create a bunch of these pipelines for them, but all these pipelines were using a Azure SQL temp table. And so with the multiple iterations running, they were all calling into the same temp table, and they would have like 5-6 different iterations all overriding the data for each iteration. And then they were wondering why the output was all screwed up. And it took, they worked on it for 3 or 4 months, couldn't figure out what it was. About that time, we were brought on as their new vendor because they weren't happy with the old vendor. I came in here, and about a week later, I was able to figure out that they had that, parallel stuff running. And all I did is come in here, set this to 1, and it fixed all their problems because it forces it to queue up the iterations instead of running them in parallel. So months of stress was fixed in a couple of days.
Wow.
So
okay, so on that, no, go ahead.
I was gonna say you have to be careful with the stuff that you're doing, because you have to keep in mind that if you call a pipeline 5 times with a different set of parameters each time, they're going to run in parallel by default, so that they're all running at the same time. And so you have to make sure that your design accounts for that kind of thing. It's a lot like programming for like parallel processes in a Windows application or things like that, where you've got stuff running in parallel. You have to make sure that they're not overriding each other, using things like locks and things like that. So it's a lot of the same concepts you have to keep in mind here.
Is it by design, like all pipelines run in parallel?
Yeah, it is by design, and they hope, I guess, that you think that stuff through when you're designing your pipeline, especially if it's going to be a complex thing. You definitely should.
But I mean, you could like daisy chain, like you got one pipeline that has to finish before the other one begins, something like that.
There are a lot of different ways that you can do that. So one of the things you can do is to call another pipeline from a pipeline.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you can have it set up so it runs through its steps, then it calls out to another pipeline, does things, waits for that to finish, and then comes back and finishes whatever it was doing. That's one way to do it. So yeah, there are ways of doing that. So.
And one more thing kind of came to mind. Like I get the power of this, but like you're moving and shifting potentially a lot of data, right? So would you do this on a data source that's your transactional SQL thing that your business is running on? Or would you rather do it like from a thing that's like a data warehouse, that's like a copy of your data? Like how expensive is it to run it on an actual database that's powering your apps?
Yeah, and that comes back again to your design. It can be done as long as you're careful with it. So obviously, I would not have, if, for instance, with your example of a database table, your production database, you have to be careful that it's not going to cause table locks for long periods of time, that kind of thing. I wouldn't do something that's going to do a lot of massive writes back to your table. But yeah, if you want to do like a read with no lock or that kind of stuff in SQL Server, that's definitely something that you can do and have it work out pretty well. So you do have to plan these things out and be careful with your planning and your design from the ground up, because you do have to consider those things. How's this going to impact my other systems? Because we are reaching out and touching a bunch of different systems. So we have to be mindful of how we're going to be touching them and what that impact is going to be, because it's not going to be a zero impact. There's obviously going to be a cost anytime that you're making those connections and pulling that data.
Yeah.
Let's see here. So, I mean, you can see here, there's a lot of different activities that you can go through, calling store procedures, calling SSIS packages. I've mentioned calling other pipelines. If you have webhooks, so the difference between web and webhooks essentially is one of them is a fire and forget, and the other one is wait for a response kind of thing. So if you want to have you can have it wait for a while if you want to do that. It does have some limited iterational stuff in here with, for each and switches and if else kind of stuff. It's still a little bit primitive, I think. It could be improved quite a bit. But there is enough functionality in there so that if you need to do things like loops or switches or that kind of stuff, that you can get through there pretty easily. One of the biggest things when you're getting into that kind of stuff, though, is to remember that each pipeline has a maximum of 50 activities that you can put into it. So there is that limit. It's in there right now. So, if you have something that's going to do a lot of complex work, you probably will want to, break that up into multiple pipelines and then use this execute pipeline, because you can call pipelines from other pipelines, and that kind of gets you past that limit. So, if you want to have 40 activities in this one and then another pipeline that has another 40 activities, you just call the one from the other. So there's that. So it does have, interaction with some of the built-in Azure machine learning stuff and Power Query as well. But to be honest, personally, I haven't done anything with any of those, so I can't really speak to any of those last couple of sections there. So that's kind of the overview of the activities that are available. And I have talked through, the data sets and the data flows a bit. The pipelines. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, like, the machine learning thing at the very end, like that could be just a whole beast by itself. Like, what can you do with that? And I don't know if Matt is still watching, because like you can, ingest a lot of data and then, I don't know, do ML on it and, try to come up with all the different things that, suggestions or any prescriptions or categorization, all types of things that machine learning can do.
Yeah. And it's another thing. It's like everything in Azure; they're constantly adding to it and constantly changing the features and availability. So, like I said, just about every time I come in here, it seems like there's something new that wasn't there before, and new things to go and learn about.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. So,
how long has this been around, Azure Data Factory? Is it?
It's
couple of years.
I've been 3 or 4 years now, I think. I want to say might not quite be that long, but it is. one of the newer ETL systems that are out there, relatively speaking. Thinking back to that slide I was showing earlier, a lot of those systems have been around for decades, some of them. So yeah, ADF is a fairly new system into there. So I did want to show a couple things that you can do. So like triggers. There's a couple of different types of triggers I mentioned. It can either be on a schedule or storage events. So for instance, a file drop, that kind of thing. You can come up with custom events. I haven't played around with that a whole lot yet, so I can't really speak to that too much. Tumbling Window is one of those things where you can set it up to not trigger until the previous run is completed. So if you have a job that you want to run like every 5 seconds, and maybe one of those runs for 7 seconds, Tumbling Window will allow the next one to queue up instead of kicking off. So that's a way you can do that as well as the concurrency thing that I showed up earlier. Triggers are one of the areas that I think are still kind of one of the weaker areas of ADF. There's not, other than the scheduled or the like the file drop in Azure Blob, there really aren't too many other triggers that you can use. But you can call an Azure Data Factory pipeline from an external endpoint. So one of the clients that I have, we've set up, or they have set up a Azure function that they call from Dynamics, and they pass into the Dynamics and say, okay, this is the pipeline I want you to run. Here's the files that I want you to process in that pipeline. And then that Azure function actually kicks off the pipeline here in Azure Data Factory. So you can call it from an external system. You can even call it from Power Automate as well. Excuse me, or a Logic app, that kind of stuff, or pretty much any external system that can then call that web API endpoint.
So another question here, and maybe I'm just I'm trying to compare things from what I've done in the past and trying to see. So when you talk about like Logic apps or Azure Functions, particularly if they're serverless, they are very, very lightweight. Like you can do simple things like push notifications or triggering another activity based on something happening to your data. This seems like a bigger thing to move, like in terms of the pipeline coming up as a VM to have all the resources that it needs to do. Like, is this something you would use? Because the Azure function type things, those are very, quick fire and forget type things that you do like transactionally as a part of your app workflow. This seems to be like squarely for like big chunks of data that you want to act on. Am I right? Or...
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I would. Yeah, this is definitely for gigabytes or terabytes of data, as opposed to a few kilobytes or a megabyte even. So yeah, again, targeting that massive scale enterprise level data sets. So. And one of the things you can do is debug through as well. I think one of the last things I wanted to show here is kind of a more complex example of how you can design your data flow. So you can have multiple pathways. You can have things that are dependent on one another. For instance, this step requires both of these to have completed first. You can also have failure pathways. So for instance, on success, that'll go here. If it fails, it'll go to this step here. Maybe that's your, like an error reporting kind of step. You can have like an on conclusion step. So, or completion step. So say, no matter what, I want to go to this one, that kind of thing. So you can do some fairly complex pathways and logic in here. This is another one where you can get yourself in trouble, where things, if you weren't expecting it to work a certain way, you can spend a lot of time trying to figure out why something's not running. A couple weeks ago, I had something set up wrong with the wrong type of pathway, and it took me a couple hours to figure out why the next step over here wasn't running, kind of thing. So that's another thing, like anything else, where you can get yourself in trouble if you're not paying attention to your design going in. So, but really, I mean, from a high level, that's pretty much all there is to Azure Data Factory. It's very simple and straightforward, but you can do a lot with it. You can, like it says, you can move a lot of data really quickly because it is designed to be very performant at high scale, high high load capacities, and I've got systems that are moving terabytes of data each day through Azure Data Factory, and it works pretty well.
Wow. Okay, so you mentioned something about the debug. Like, do you actually see real-time data coming in, and like, can you debug through what's coming in from data set?
So yeah, let me actually just run this one here. So if you hit debug, one of the things you can do is you can see it actually running in real time. Sometimes it'll refresh. Okay, it failed. So in this particular case, you can actually go in here. You can see the actual error messages that came up. So in this particular case, like I had, can't insert a null value into a particular table column. See if I've got one. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Let me go ahead and run this one through.
And based on like what your pipeline is, you might have a variable amount of processing that you need. And in Azure, I'm guessing that spins up whatever it needs to, to do the transformations.
Yeah, it'll spin up the runtimes that it needs to run. One of the things to keep in mind is that it has one instance for most of your pipelines that run in the cloud. I mentioned the other instances that you do for on-prem. But when you're doing the data flows, which are the more complex, conversions and that kind of stuff, those actually spin up in their own runtime, separate from the main runtime. So sometimes if it hasn't spun one up in a while, if it's been sitting idle, it can take 2 or 3 minutes to spin up a new instance. So sometimes you'll see a pipeline just sit for like 2, 3, 4 minutes. It's generally because it's waiting on a data flow to start running. So I had this simple one here. So this one, basically what it does is it just calls out to another pipeline. That other pipeline just has a wait step that sits and waits for about 5 seconds. But as you can see, when you're doing the debug, you can actually see it running through each of the steps. It'll tell you how long it ran, tell you what time it started, tell you what type of pipeline it was. If there are errors, you'll see those errors over here. But you can also see for each of these, you'll see a couple things here where it has like an input and an output. So that if there are things that are passed in, if it calls out to another pipeline, you'll see here, for instance, here it calls another pipeline. You can actually click on that and go see the execution for that step of the pipeline. In this particular case, it just waited for 5 seconds, then returned. Go back. So for each of those, you won't see all the data. But what you can do sometimes is see like a subset of data. For instance, if it's doing, a lot of times if it's doing like a SQL copy, it'll sometimes show you the first row of data just to see a sample of it. But it won't show you all the data in here, but you can see all the steps that it ran. You can see a lot of the inputs and outputs. If it passed parameters, you'll see those. So you can see what actually was being passed into every activity and what came out of it at each activity. So, and pipeline, so that it makes it a lot easier to debug the issues. And then if you go back over here to the monitor that I showed you here earlier, so I forgot to mention that here, there's a couple different ones. If it was triggered by a normal trigger from external, you'll see it under here. But if you ran it under debug, you'll see it here. So here you can see a bunch of previous steps. So for each of those, you can see a lot of stuff. For instance, the error messages. You can see what it was triggered by. You can see whether it was successful or not. And in these, you'll see every pipeline that is called. So if a pipeline calls another pipeline, then you'll see multiple values here or multiple rows in here. And one of the things that you can do, actually, let me go back over here to the pipeline. Oh, yeah. So it doesn't do it when you do a debug, but if a pipeline ran off of a trigger or an external trigger, one of the things that you can do is you can come back in here under monitor, and here you can see it's actually running. So in this particular instance, because I had those concurrencies set up to not run at the same time, you can see they're queued here. But one of the things that it'll let you do is to rerun a particular instance. So in this particular case, if I had been, had this particular instance that was running and it ran and maybe it failed or something like that, and it passed in certain parameters, maybe you have to go out and fix a piece of data or fix a file or something like that, and then you want to rerun it. All you have to do is just come back in here and click this button where it says rerun, and it'll actually rerun that segment of the pipeline, passing in the exact same parameters that it used previously. So you don't have to type all those parameters in again, or you have to do anything like that. As long as your prerequisites are in place, you can just rerun it with a click of the button. So that's one of the really cool things about the monitor step here in the ADF.
Yeah, no, very cool. I got a couple more questions, and again, Matt or chat room, let us know if you need to, have any other burning questions in mind. What are some like real world use cases? You said you got a lot of stuff that's running. Can you give us some examples of something that ADF is really, really good at?
Yeah, so for instance, for one of my biggest clients right now, one of the most common use cases that we're using for that is they have an implementation of Microsoft Dynamics, but they also have external systems that they need to move that data back and forth to. So some of the examples, they have an external warehouse management system. They need to move things like sales orders, transfer orders back and forth between those systems. We use ADF for that. They have an HR system where they've got all their new employees. We've got a system in there where it passes it through ADF and then back into Dynamics, and it creates all those employee records that it needs in Dynamics. This company is a retailer, so they have a loss prevention reporting system to help them keep track of theft and losses and things like that. So again, we do exports out of Dynamics and into their their loss prevention system, that kind of stuff. We've got another client where I was using it to move data back and forth between a couple of their systems and Snowflake, which is their enterprise business intelligence system, where they do a bunch of reporting there. Another thing we were doing is moving data back and forth between Active Directory and their a couple of training systems that they were using. So, if a new employee got it added to Active Directory, it would pull that data, it would copy it out to their training system and automatically set up an account for them there. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with it. So
yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned like reporting. This is like gold if you have to clear up and then cleanse your data, move it, and then do reporting on it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you mentioned probably a dozen of other tools. Like, so what brought you to ADF? Have you used some of the other ones?
I've used some of them in the past. One of my previous jobs, I did work with a couple of systems that were more EDI focused, but they did a lot of that data transformation as well. But as far as like pure ETL system, Data Factory's probably been the one that I've used by far more than any other. A couple of others I've had some exposure to, but not a whole lot of usage. Some people would consider SSIS to be an ETL, but I don't really think that it is. That's more an opinion thing, and I did include it on my list, on that other slide in the presentation. But
no, and it's clearly working for your clients and the things that you're doing, and you're not getting paid to talk about Azure Data Factory, but here you are using it and talking about it. So that's a good use case.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the better systems, and they've really invested a lot of time and effort into it. Still has some things I think they could improve on, but what doesn't? Yeah.
Exactly. All right. What else did you have in mind, Barret?
I don't know. I think that pretty well covers it. So if anybody has any questions or anything, they can.
And I am trying to fix my lighting because it's like 7 p.m. All of my lighting kind of turns into a nighttime mode and just dims everything.
Yeah.
Okay, so you got integer men liking it. That's all that matters. We are here to make Matt happy.
That's right. Matt is the man.
That is the man. No, this is really insightful. So thank you for giving us an overview, and I'm sure there's a lot more to ETL and a lot of things that you're gonna get in the weeds of once you start using this. Yeah, user group content as a service. Yeah. All right, so there you have it, folks. You got Barrett's Twitter and email and everything. So if you have questions, you know how to get a hold of Barret. Yes, thank you, Barret, for taking the time. I know it's probably. Have you had dinner, or it's coming up after this?
Oh no, yeah, it's after this. So.
Yeah, me too.
Nothing planned yet.
There you go. Yeah, I hold off, having dinner after this as well. So. Thank you. This is the time in the user group where we will. Sometimes we would have gotten pizza before. This is the one thing that we really miss out on the user group, and also like ping pong. We used to play a lot of ping pong because we used to meet at in the eastern offices of Improving.
Oh yeah.
So that's the one in person hanging out that we miss out. But I mean we will look for Christmas or any of the holidays where we can get together. But I think every day or every month, this casual hangout works out. We don't have to travel and increase our carbon footprint.
Yeah, I do miss some of that.
Yeah. Well, and that's why you have the bigger conferences where we can get together. All right, folks, thank you so much in the chat room if you're watching, or if you're watching this at any other time, because we do record and put this up on YouTube. Here's a slide where you can get hold of Barret and ask him any questions as you start tinkering with ETLs and moving massive mountains of data. So this is very good stuff, and I'm going to take your desktop down here, Barret, and
all right.
One more time, thank you so much for taking the time to come and speak to us. And and if you are one of our user group regulars, or if you had signed up through the meetup, you may have seen a Teams link. If you just want to turn on your cameras and ask questions, or just kind of hang out after this, we'll hop on there for a few minutes. Totally optional, but if you are going to be there, we'll see you there. But otherwise, that's it. That's it for the stream. So
thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I hope you all have a good night and take care. All right, bye-bye.
Good night.